I'm Pamela Collins. I chair the Department of Mental Health here at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, and I'm Tina's advisor. And this is kind of like the trailers, so we'll start the trailers and then people will come in for the main speech. I am really delighted to be here, as I'm sure all of you are too. Tina and I met while I was at the National Institute of Mental Health. She actually reached out to me to discuss global mental health career options and what does that look like. Neither of us had any idea that we would actually be working together in Seattle at the University of Washington just a few years later. So she joined the University of Washington as a doctoral student. I know she'll tell you more about that. And we began to work together in that first phase of her doctoral training, and now again in the second phase of her doctoral training here at Johns Hopkins. I want to just point out that Tina has consistently shared her interest and commitment to authentic engagement of young people in matters related to youth mental health research, policy, practice, and advocacy. And her academic journey with me began with this focus on youth engagement. We were part of a collaborative project that recruited Indian, British, and South African young people in technology design and data sharing about their mental health. Tina studied the level of youth engagement and youth participation among the youth co-investigators and advisors in this project, which kind of launched her on that path. And at the same time, our team was seeking to understand how young people in Seattle specifically identified both the gaps in mental health care as well as opportunities for mental health services and their perspectives on all of this. And Tina led our mixed methods review of these data, helping us to understand how young people thought about the array of mental health interventions that were developed in the US as well as other parts of the world. And finally, she became involved in our global study of priorities for urban adolescent mental health and contributed to our qualitative analysis of how the COVID-19 pandemic influenced perspectives on urban lives for adolescents. And this priority setting research informs the presentation that you're about to see today. So I'm delighted to have shared this much of Tina's academic journey. She has shown courage and grit in navigating two excellent doctoral programs and changing course as needed, but remaining true to the research questions that align with her goals. And she's also embraced the community of global mental health researchers and adolescent health researchers and advocates. And I can't wait to see how she's going to continue to contribute to this community. So without further ado, Tina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pamela. That was really kind. Hi, everyone. My name is Tina Mensa-Kwao, and I'm excited to be sharing my dissertation research entitled Investigating the Impact of Urban Spaces on Youth Mental Health Globally. I'm going to start this presentation today by respectfully acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the contemporary and traditional homelands of the Piscataway and the Susquehanna peoples. We honored their stewardship of this land throughout the ages and their ongoing contributions. We also acknowledge the people enslaved and exploited who did and do work on this land, enabling us to live. We recognize that our current systems are often unjust and that the comfort of many still rests upon the suffering of others. I've included links to the tribes at the bottom of the slide and encourage you all to learn more. I'd also like to recognize my identity and positionality in the context of this research. I'm a cisgender Ghanaian American woman, an immigrant from a working class background, and a young adult. My research focuses on youth mental health globally and locally in Baltimore. While my lived experiences may not fully reflect the communities that I serve, I'm committed to building partnerships to ensure this work reflects the needs and voices of young people. So welcome aboard. I'd love for you all to join me on my flight to dissertation. I am your pilot for today, and this is a boarding pass that captures my journey toward a PhD. This flight is fueled by my unwavering commitment to advancing global mental health, a field that is both deeply personal and professionally meaningful to me. So buckle up, enjoy the ride, and thank you for joining me. This flight began over 30 years ago in Accra, Ghana. You can follow along the plane at the bottom. After immigrating to the US at 1, I was raised in a predominantly Black neighborhood in New Jersey. I've loved science growing up, and by 4th grade, I already dreamed of earning a PhD. High school lab research sparked my interest in the brain, leading me to study neuroscience and global development in college. But over time, I realized I was more drawn to people than pipettes. Semester at sea and a global mental health course helped me find my path. After a gap year, I earned my master's at Emory, where I began working on mental health projects globally and locally. My master's practicum in Haiti with Dr. Bonnie Kaiser taught me how culture shapes mental illness. I'll never forget our translator pointing out to the hills and saying, des monts, beyond mountains, there are mountains. 4 years ago, I could barely see the top of this PhD mountain, yet here we are today. After my master's, my time at the CDC showed me global health leadership must include voices from affected communities, and this further fueled my drive to pursue a PhD and become one of those voices. With that goal in mind, I began my PhD in global health implementation science at the University of Washington in 2021, working with Dr. Collins on global mental health projects, as she mentioned. After 2 great years at UW, I changed aircrafts and moved to Baltimore in 2023 to complete my PhD here at Hawkins, a move that deepened my commitment to global mental health and serving communities like my own. The inspiration behind my research is Ama, my 17-year-old mentee who lives in Kumasi, Ghana's second largest city. When I visited her during the pandemic, she shared how difficult it was to get around without a car, especially when public transportation was down. The nearest park was over an hour away by foot and not safe to reach, limiting her ability to connect with friends or simply be outdoors. Her experience made me think, what does it mean for a young person to feel trapped in their own city, unable to access safe, supportive spaces? Her story isn't unique, and it highlights the urgent need to design cities that support young people's mental health. Welcome to Dissertation City. Over the next 40 minutes, I'll walk you through my 3 dissertation aims, starting with some background, then diving into each study and wrapping up with key takeaways. Let's begin with some background. Most of the world now lives in cities. This is a map of the current share of population living in urban areas around the world. The darker teal means higher density of people, as you see in the Americas. Now I'm going to play this video to show the projections of urban populations in the next couple decades. By 2050, 68% of people, approximately 7 billion, will live in urban areas, with 90% of that growth happening in Asia and Africa. As urbanization increases and more people move to cities, this includes adolescents, and more young people will be growing up in urban environments. Hence, it's important to understand how urban environments shape their development. Adolescence is a sensitive developmental period characterized by changes in the brain, such as growth in white matter, hormonal changes like puberty, and the influence of social and cultural environmental factors which shape a young person's development. Half of mental illnesses that are present in adulthood start by the age of 14, and 75% by age 25. Therefore, focusing on this developmental period has important mental health implications. The environments that young people grow up in matter, and it shapes their mental health, especially urban public spaces, which includes parks, plazas, and community centers. Although much of the research comes from high-income countries, some studies have shown that urbanicity is associated with greater risk of mental illness. One potential way to mitigate these risks and promote youth mental health is through the built and natural environment and improving access to urban public spaces. Green spaces like nature trails and trees, and blue spaces like harbors and rivers can affect youth mental health through several direct and indirect pathways. I want to point out that the quality of these spaces, not just their availability, correlates with reduced stress levels and fewer mental health issues. My dissertation aims to look more critically at access to urban public spaces and how that influences youth mental health. When most people think about access, they think about proximity. For my dissertation, I adapted the 5 A's of Access framework, which outlines 5 key dimensions. Accessibility involves ensuring that individuals can easily reach and use urban public spaces. Availability refers to the presence and distribution of spaces such as parks within a city. Accommodation involves ensuring that spaces are designed and maintained to accommodate the diverse needs of its residents. Affordability refers to the financial cost associated with using a space. And finally, acceptability involves in considering the diverse cultural backgrounds and preferences of the population when designing and maintaining spaces. We assume that improving access will lead to greater use of public spaces among young people. According to the literature, green and blue spaces specifically affect youth mental health directly by facilitating stress reduction and through indirect pathways such as fostering social connection, promoting physical activity, and mitigating air pollution, noise, and heat. Urban public spaces can function as protective environments that promote positive well-being, but when they're neglected, unsafe, or inaccessible, they may contribute to negative mental health outcomes. These outcomes can be modified by various social demographic variables. My dissertation aims to fill gaps in the literature on youth mental health in urban public spaces. First, limited research explores how youth perceive access to urban public spaces and its impact on their mental health. Aim 1 explores how young people perceive access to urban public spaces by first identifying which spaces they see as most supportive of their mental health. Second, few studies examine how youth mental health symptoms relate spatially to urban public spaces, particularly blue spaces. Aim 2 describes the spatial relationships between youth mental health symptoms and proximity to green, blue, and park spaces in Baltimore. Finally, existing research focuses on mental health risks with little attention to positive outcomes like hope in urban settings. Aim 3 examines the associations between access to green, blue, and park spaces and both hope and negative mental health outcomes among youth in Baltimore. To answer this question, our research questions, we used an exploratory mixed methods approach. This allowed me to begin with a global qualitative analysis, which then informed the spatial and statistical analyses in my local Baltimore case study. So let's dive into Aim 1. Youth voices everywhere must be amplified in conversations about their mental health. To understand which urban public spaces truly matter and how accessible they feel, we must listen. So how do we ensure these voices are heard? In Aim 1, we turn to youth themselves. We conducted a secondary qualitative analysis using the Making Cities Mental Health Friendly for Adolescents and Young Adults study. In 2020, a 3-round global priority setting study was conducted across 53 countries to identify characteristics of cities that support youth mental health. Participants were recruited through network referrals from relevant urban sectors, including education, built environment, and health. For this dissertation, we specifically used a subset of the participants aged 14 through 35. I want to note that in the original study, all participants received a concept note defining adolescents as age 10 to 24 and were instructed to consider this age group in their responses. We analyzed responses to Survey 1 open-ended question, what are the characteristics of a mental health friendly city for young people? To analyze the survey responses, we used a conceptual content analysis to identify and organize key themes. First, we memoed the responses to surface emerging themes. This informed our codebook, which combined deductive codes like the 5 A's of Access framework and inductive codes, meaning themes that emerged from the data. These themes included safety and enablers of access. We then pilot tested the codebook and refined it through coding. After coding all the responses, we identified and organized codes into 3 key themes: types of urban public spaces, dimensions of access, and uses of urban public spaces. We then analyzed responses at the word and phrase level to calculate frequency counts per participant. Finally, we applied thematic analysis to interpret patterns across the data and the broader meanings across participant responses. Participants in our study were predominantly aged 25 through 35, female, and from Nepal. In response to the question, what are the characteristics of a mental health friendly city, participants most frequently highlighted green spaces, and you can see everything that's highlighted frequently with the red boxes. So green spaces, the importance of welcoming or acceptable spaces, using spaces for social connection, and safety in urban public spaces. Youth emphasized safety across green, blue, and other public spaces. Green spaces were valued for their restorative and common qualities. Blue spaces were appreciated for their aesthetic and sensory experiences. And other public spaces referred to community-oriented places like youth centers. Our data corresponds to the dimensions of access across the 5 A's framework. Our data showed that acceptable spaces are welcoming, inclusive, culturally relevant, and aesthetically pleasing. For instance, a male participant from Nepal described a city with naturally friendly spaces. There should be trees and gardens around the city that would make the mood of youth fresh. Accommodating spaces had thoughtful infrastructure and inclusive design, as well as amenities. Accessible spaces are easy to reach, for instance, within walking distance. Available spaces meant having more diverse urban public spaces. And finally, affordable spaces meant having free or low-cost access to public spaces. Young people described uses of public space to promote their mental health. And these uses included for social connection and community support, like informal gatherings, recreational activities like exercise and play, mental health activities such as meditation or yoga, creative expression through arts and performance, and an interesting indirect use of spaces emerged from our data, with participants noting that green spaces support youth mental health by promoting sustainability. One female participant from India described, rising air pollution levels and vanishing green cover define our environments in urban cities and have a lasting impact on our mental, physical, and emotional well-being. In highly unequal societies, resources such as greenery, clean air have become a luxury and a privilege. A mental health friendly city should promote and adopt sustainable living practices. Youth also identified certain factors as both enablers and barriers to accessing urban public spaces, depending on the context. These factors included costs, accommodating amenities, safety, availability of spaces, and inclusive design. One female participant from Nepal emphasized youth-friendly transportation as a key enabler of access, highlighting features such as bike lanes. Barriers also highlighted broader systemic issues. A male participant from the US noted environmental racism, disproportionate exposure to toxins and pollution, and other social determinants of health, segregation, over-policing must also be addressed. Improving access to public spaces for youth means shaping policies that prioritize both youth-friendly design as well as structural barriers like over-policing. Notable gender differences emerged in how youth perceived supportive urban spaces. Although there were some differences among female participants, most focused on inclusivity, non-judgmental spaces, and emotional safety. A female participant from Kenya described a city where young people can express their feelings without any judgment. Male participants, on the other hand, prioritized efficient infrastructure, clear organization, and physical safety. A male participant from Kenya described the benefit of some sort of order. This is where the park is, this is where the bus stop is, with toll-free numbers if a young person is stranded. So males and females seem to have different needs and priorities when it comes to public spaces. To create equitable, high-quality urban public spaces, we must consider those differences. For example, when designing parks, there should be clear, visible signs that promote both physical and emotional safety, such as well-lit pathways and gender-neutral bathrooms. Our AIM-1 findings made one thing clear. Young people know what they need from urban public spaces to support their mental health. Green spaces were most valued for helping to reduce stress, improve mood, and foster social connection. Safe spaces were a high priority, not just physical safety, but emotionally safe spaces that are free from harm, stigma, and discrimination. Socialization and recreation emerged as top uses of spaces for connection, play, and movement. And interestingly, and that's why it's interesting because it's A, and we're talking about the 5 A's of access. So interestingly, accessibility and accommodation were mentioned more often than proximity. So youth really do care about how spaces feel and what it offers. Across our data, one message stood out. Young people want a voice in shaping the spaces that support their mental health. Key global priorities identified in AIM 1, such as access to green, blue, and park spaces, the availability of amenities, feeling safe, and using public spaces for social connection, informed our analyses in the Baltimore case study. These priorities were reflected in the selection of our environmental and psychosocial variables to examine associations with youth mental health. In the next 2 aims, we apply the global youth insights to the Baltimore context and explore how urban public spaces relate to youth mental health locally. This is Baltimore. In Baltimore, youth face heightened stressors that affect their mental health, like poverty, violence, and environmental disparities, such as lack of access to high-quality green spaces. These challenges are compounded by a history of redlining dating back to the 1930s. Redlining was a discriminatory practice in which government-backed agencies marked predominantly Black and immigrant neighborhoods in red on maps to label them as high risk for investment. This led to widespread denials of loans and reinforced racial and economic segregation, and we can still see these effects today. A 2021 Annie E. Casey Foundation report found nearly 1 in 4 Baltimore high schoolers seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year, and this was between 2022 and 2023. This statistic is not just alarming, it's a call to action. We have to ask, what environments are young people living in? What supports or fails to support their mental health? In Baltimore, like many urban settings, mental health challenges are deeply tied to place. That's why our research focuses right here in Baltimore City, using data from Project Power, a 4-year randomized control trial that assessed the effectiveness of a trauma-informed intervention for 8th graders. For this dissertation, we used baseline survey data of 32 urban public schools from 2016 to 2020, focusing on self-reported measures of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, and hope. Our study included 599 adolescents who are primarily female and African American. There was also a slightly higher number of youth living in redlined areas. To evaluate the spatial relationships between youth mental health and neighborhood level environmental factors in Baltimore, first, we geocoded youth residential addresses, meaning we converted their addresses into specific points on the map. All the youth in our sample matched for this analysis, but we only included those that were within the Baltimore city limits. Then we spatially joined the youth locations to nearby environmental features of interest. This was specifically green, blue, and park spaces, as well as neighborhood level factors, including crime rates, social vulnerability, and historical redlining status. The data were at the census tract level, which is commonly used as a proxy for neighborhoods. Next, we wanted to visualize where Baltimore youth mental health needs were the highest. So let's suppose each red dot on this map represents individual points or locations of youth in our study. However, not all dots are the same. Some youth reported elevated symptoms of depression, anxiety, PTSD, and low hope. So we gave these dots more weight in our analyses, while others reported fewer symptoms or none at all. For weighting, we created a comorbidity mental health score. Comorbidity means having more than one condition at a time. For instance, a score of 1 means a young person has elevated depression. 2, a young person has elevated depression and elevated anxiety, and so on. Cutoff points for elevated mental health symptoms were based on validated thresholds, and for hope, we used 1 standard deviation below the sample mean. Higher scores meant higher symptom burden and more influence on the map. We use these maps to estimate a smooth heat map of youth mental health needs. This map highlights hotspots where comorbidity is highest. Bigger circles, more burden. After mapping comorbidity hotspots in Baltimore, we examined how these clusters relate to structural inequities like historical redlining and social vulnerability. We hypothesized that historically redlined neighborhoods and those with higher social vulnerability would show higher concentrations of youth with comorbid mental health conditions. To test our hypothesis, we mapped and analyzed the data to see if mental health symptoms were indeed more concentrated in historically redlined and socially vulnerable areas. We used a one-way ANOVA to test whether youth comorbidity clustering varied by neighborhood characteristics. We analyzed several factors, but I'll focus on our redlining data due to time. So this box plot compares comorbidity scores for youth living in redlined versus not redlined neighborhoods. As shown, youth in redlined neighborhoods tend to experience more co-occurring mental health conditions compared to their peers in non-redlined areas. In addition to our redlining results, several neighborhood-level social and environmental factors were significantly correlated with youth comorbidity. Our one-way ANOVA test also showed that greater density of youth with comorbid mental health conditions was significantly associated with greater overall social vulnerability in all subdomains except for housing and transportation. Notably, youth in areas with less access to green and blue spaces and higher crime rates had significantly higher levels of mental health comorbidity. To help visualize these statistically significant relationships and how they look across Baltimore, we created this bivariate map. It shows how youth mental health comorbidity clusters alongside structural vulnerabilities. Areas shaded in blue show high social vulnerability, while those in red indicate high comorbidity. When both overlap, we see a deep purple, and this highlights the neighborhoods facing the greatest combined burden. Next, I added redline areas to the map, which you can see with the cross-hatched lines. Our results supported our hypothesis that historically redlined areas and those with higher social vulnerability show higher concentrations of youth with comorbid mental health conditions, as you can see with the red circles. So here are the 3 key takeaways from AIM-2. When we mapped where youth in Baltimore faced the highest mental health burdens, we found clear hotspots in historically redlined areas. These areas showed significantly elevated comorbidity of depression, anxiety, and PTSD symptoms, along with reduced levels of hope. Comorbidity clustered in places with high social vulnerability and limited access to green and blue spaces. This highlights how structural racism and environmental inequities shape adolescent well-being. Youth mental health isn't just about individual risk, it's also about place, and interventions should target neighborhoods with the highest needs. In my final aim, I statistically test these relationships in Baltimore. So I took these pictures last week on my way to a friend's house in Baltimore. And when we talk about investing in green space, it's not just about adding more. It's about how it's maintained. Is it clean? Is it safe? Welcoming? Context matters. In AIM-1, global youth, especially girls, express different perceptions of green spaces, particularly in terms of emotional safety. This led me to ask the question, how do these nuances between green space exposure and youth mental health differ across groups? like gender. To dig deeper, aim 3, we explore these patterns through statistical modeling. We measured individual level variables, including psychosocial, behavioral, and positive and negative mental health outcomes. We also measured the following environmental and social variables listed here. Specifically for green, blue, park space, and crime rates, I created my own scale that grouped neighborhood level exposures into quartiles for easier comparison. We assessed two key metrics, proportion of green, blue, and park spaces, and we also calculated a neighborhood amenity rate. We looked at how many amenities like playgrounds and bikes were available to youth in each neighborhood. So for instance, some areas might have one amenity for every 100 children or young people, while others have one for every 1,000. So the competition with amenities is different. To examine associations between individual and neighborhood level factors and youth mental health outcomes, we use the multi-level mixed effects model with census tracts as random intercepts. So what does this mean? It means we accounted for differences between neighborhoods. This helped us control for the fact that youth living in the same neighborhood may share similar experiences. To keep the model simple and accurate, we chose variables based on past research as well as initial univariate tests. If two variables were too similar, like marijuana and blunt use, we only kept one. We also used the composite social vulnerability index score and not the subdomains. We ran the following models. Full effects models assess the overall effect without subgroup separation. We then stratified models by sex and redlining status given prior research. There's evidence that sex differences in stress response and emotion regulation during adolescence. So we analyzed outcomes separately for males and females. The literature also highlights how historical redlining contributes to mental health inequities through environmental and social stressors. So we compared groups or results across redlining categories. And finally, we ran exploratory interaction models. So this is a forest plot and how I will present my AIM3 results. So let me explain what you're looking at. This specific plot shows how different factors are associated with youth hope. So for instance, let's look at peer relationships. The dot is to the right of the red vertical line at 0. This means that better peer relationships are associated with higher levels of hope in youth. If the dot were to the left of the red line, it would be a negative association, like we see here with maladaptive coping. The horizontal line extending from the dot represents the confidence interval. In the case of peer relationships, the dot does not cross the red vertical line at 0. Hence, this association is considered statistically significant, indicating a likely true positive relationship. Our main effects models showed that psychosocial variables were the strongest and most consistent predictors of youth mental health across all outcomes, including hope, which we're looking at here, as well as depression, anxiety, PTSD symptoms, and comorbidity. In each case, psychosocial variables showed stronger associations with mental health outcomes than environmental factors. As I mentioned, environmental variables were not statistically associated with youth mental health outcomes. However, I did want to point out some notable trends. Green space showed an unexpected trend toward higher levels of depression symptoms, and blue spaces appeared slightly protective against depression, though again, the association was not statistically significant. In our sex stratified models, environmental exposures impacted males and females differently, with some green and park spaces unexpectedly associated with poor mental health outcomes, especially among females. In females, which is highlighted here, higher perceived neighborhood safety showed a trend toward lower PTSD severity. Moderate to high park exposure was consistently associated with lower hope scores, and exposure to greater than 10% green space was associated with higher depression. In males, now highlighted, moderate park area exposure was associated with higher depression and lower anxiety scores, and low blue space exposure was associated with lower depression. Notably, among males residing in historically redlined neighborhoods was associated with lower levels of depression and overall mental health comorbidity. This is a counterintuitive finding that warrants further investigation. This plot is showing only data in redlined areas because there were very few significant associations found in non-redlined areas. We found that certain environmental exposures were associated with youth mental health only in redlined areas. In these areas, for instance, greater blue space exposure was associated with lower youth anxiety. Now, although exploratory and not part of our primary outcomes, our interaction models revealed nuanced relationships that reinforce the importance of context in shaping young people's mental health risk. For instance, among girls living in moderately vulnerable neighborhoods, greater amenity availability was significantly associated with higher levels of hope. And among males, moderate park exposure was associated with significantly higher anxiety scores in neighborhoods with moderate or moderately high levels of crime. Kind of interesting, right? Our AIM 3 findings revealed that psychosocial factors were the strongest drivers of youth mental health outcomes, more so than environmental exposures. However, in redlined areas, environmental exposures showed stronger and more significant associations with youth mental health outcomes than in non-redlined areas. We also found that green and blue spaces are not uniformly beneficial. Context matters. The impact of environmental features on youth mental health varied by sex, crime, and redlining status. Now it's time to bring it all together. What matters most for young people's mental health in cities? This dissertation sheds light on how urban public spaces shape youth mental health, not just through physical access. Youth around the world told us they value safe, inclusive, multifunctional spaces where they can connect with others, exercise, and relieve stress. However, in Baltimore, we found that access doesn't guarantee impact. Therefore, the benefits of green and blue spaces are context-specific and shaped by gender, safety, and structural factors. Importantly, hope as a positive outcome revealed different patterns, especially by gender. And finally, structural inequities like redlining continue to shape both access and experience of public spaces in Baltimore. To support mental health equitably, we must design spaces not just for youth, but with them, grounded in local context, their lived experience. This leads me to my 3 specific policy recommendations for improving urban public spaces for youth in Baltimore. Recommendation 1 is to implement equity-centered urban design practices that address historical disinvestment to ensure communities have access to safe, high-quality green and blue spaces. Our research showed that limited access to green and blue spaces is associated with more severe mental health outcomes among youth in Baltimore. To respond, we must reinvest in high-quality public spaces in redlined, highly vulnerable neighborhoods, not just prioritizing access, but clean, safe, and well-maintained spaces. Stewardship also matters. Sustained care requires long-term planning and funding for local trusted groups who know their community the best. Finally, to prevent displacement, we must scale models like community land trusts. These ensure residents benefit from environmental improvements without being pushed out. Baltimore Green Space is one example supporting communities, especially Black neighborhoods, to reclaim and steward land. Programs like this need to be expanded. Recommendation 2 is to co-design healing-centered and gender-responsive public spaces with young people. Over half of the youth in our study reported symptoms of depression or anxiety, reflecting a deeper crisis rooted in chronic disinvestment. To address this, we need healing-centered design, public spaces that don't just look good, but help young people feel safe, seen, and connected. This includes design features like gender-neutral bathrooms. But healing spaces must be co-designed with youth, not just for them. Planning processes must center youth voices and the youth from gender diverse and historically excluded communities. Baltimore already has models like this. Muse 360 Arts, which is a youth-led, culturally rooted, and healing-focused organization, works with youth and does just this. Efforts like these should be scaled and embedded in city planning. And finally, cities should adopt frameworks like Thrives to guide inclusive, equitable, and sustainable urban design. While recommendations 1 and 2 focused on what needs to change, this recommendation is about how we go about making those changes happen. Recommendation 3 is to create multi-sectoral partnerships. Achieving youth mental health equity in Baltimore means breaking down silos and including youth in the process. A first step is to establish a youth mental health task force with young leaders, city agencies, and trusted community partners. We also need to use place-based data like redlining maps and social vulnerability index to guide investments where they're needed the most. Finally, we must redefine success, not just more parks, but how young people feel in these spaces. Embedding mental health equity metrics in urban design helps track that. And cities like Toronto are leading the way with plans that center mental health, equity, and shared governance. Baltimore can do the same. Now, while my dissertation offers valuable insights, there are some limitations. It lacks a gentrification measure, which may miss recent neighborhood changes affecting youth mental health. The sample is drawn from Project Power, which focuses on underserved schools and doesn't fully represent all youth, especially those who are not in school. We use proximity to green and blue spaces as a proxy for access, which doesn't capture how young people actually experience these spaces. Our green space land cover measure doesn't distinguish between tree canopy and grass. Finally, the findings are specific to Baltimore, though they do echo patterns in other post-industrial cities like Detroit and Philadelphia. Despite these limitations, this dissertation makes unique contributions. It uses a mixed methods design, blending global youth insights with local spatial analyses, drawing on youth voices from over 30 countries. Methodologically, it applies hotspot analysis to map mental health clustering and their alignment with historically redlined and vulnerable neighborhoods. It also includes both negative and positive mental health outcomes, especially hope, which is a marker of resilience. And throughout, it applies a structural equity lens, framing racism and disinvestment as central drivers of mental health inequities. So to wrap up, this dissertation shows that youth mental health isn't just shaped by services, it's shaped by place. Where young people live, learn, and gather matters. If we want to reduce negative mental health outcomes and build hope for youth, we must create environments that feel safe and affirming. Let's not wait. Let's make Baltimore a youth mental health friendly city. This means investing in quality spaces, listening to youth, and repairing decades of disinvestment. I would like to acknowledge the Global Mental Health Training Grant for supporting my time at Hopkins, as well as the Bill and Melinda Gates Scholarship for 10 years of my educational funding. I also want to sincerely acknowledge the funding support that enabled the original studies, which made the secondary analyses in my dissertation possible, and extend my gratitude to all the participants who generously shared their experiences and data. And now for my acknowledgements. First and foremost, I thank God for guiding my steps, giving me strength, and truly carrying me to this moment. I'm deeply grateful to my advisor, Dr. Pamela Collins. There truly aren't enough words to express how much I've learned from you and grown under your mentorship. Your guidance has shaped not just my work, but the way I think and lead. And honestly, I'd move all over again just to keep learning from you. To my thesis advisory committee members, Tamar, Laura, Michael, I came to Hopkins a little later than most, but you welcomed me with open arms. You've been there for me when I needed it the most, and your unwavering support and guidance throughout this dissertation process has truly been invaluable. Lori, You're one of the first people I met when I visited Hopkins, and you've been a constant source of support ever since. I'm especially grateful for your willingness to step in as my chair. To my thesis readers, thank you for reading my work and supporting me. To my UW community, especially my former cohort, mentors, and friends who began this PhD journey with me, thank you so much for still being here with me, even though I left. And to the mentors, peers I've gained at Hopkins over the past 2 years, thank you for easing my transition and helping me find my way. Oops. Special thanks to my parents. I love you, Mommy and Daddy, and I'm forever grateful for your prayers, your love, and your belief in me. Daddy, you've been calling me doctor for several years now, pretty much manifesting this day. And so I'm thankful you'll get to see it become a reality. To my sisters, nieces, family back in Ghana, and to the friends who walked with me through every high and low, I appreciate you more than you know. You've encouraged me, made me laugh, reminded me of who I am when I needed it the most. I couldn't have made it through this journey without each of you. There are so many, many more people that shaped this dissertation and my educational journey than I could ever capture in 2 slides. You know who you are, and I'm deeply thankful for each of you. Your prayers, presence, and encouragement have made all the difference. And thank you to me.
For questions, and Tina, I'll monitor the chat if you want to.
Oh, yes, go ahead. Samaya. Yeah, thank you for the question. So I would say one of my favorite parts of this dissertation was working with my master's students. So to do my qualitative analysis, I recruited 2 amazing master's students, Evelyn and Joseph. Thank you so much for your support and for helping me code through a lot of data and make sense of it and reflect through the data with me. That whole process of just like meeting and managing and working with a team through the data was really exciting, and I learned so much from them, especially their different perspectives. So I would say that's probably one of my most favorite parts of this process. Thanks for the question. Yes, Dr. Dan Sleshnik.
Yeah, great presentation. Congratulations on all the work that it took to get to today. I thought the 5-factor framework was really interesting, and just wanted to pick your brain a little bit on, do you think that the 5 A's were sufficient to capture the respondents' responses to the questions that you asked?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so, as I mentioned, I adapted the 5 A's of framework, 5 A's of access framework, which include the 5 A's of access that go a little bit deeper than just proximity. And so in my actual dissertation, which when it comes out, I'll be happy to give you a copy, I specifically outline 2 additional A's that should be added to the model. One that's already been talked about in the literature by Soderman, and that is the awareness A of access. And that really dives into whether or not people are aware of these spaces to begin with, and whether or not city planners are actually, making sure that these spaces are aware to the community. The second A that I propose to add to the framework is atmosphere. So in our data, as I mentioned with the one participant from India, air pollution, rising heat levels, climate resilience, that also came out in our data from a few of our participants. And so atmosphere truly covers like the idea that, the environment is not just physical space, it's living space. And so we really need to take into account thinking about how do we reduce heat? How do we reduce noise and pollution? How do we reduce these environmental factors that are also huge effects to youth mental health, everybody's mental health, to be quite honest. Thanks for the question. There's Tenzin. There's people online. I think we can hear you. So if you just unmute yourself.
Yes. Hi. Thank you for such a great presentation. I love that picture of you, baby you. And I love all the work that you've done, especially being interested in youth mental health myself and well-being. I had a question. You touched on it right now, but I'm wondering if in your dissertation you looked at noise pollution, even though there are green spaces and accessible green and blue spaces like parks, historically poorer neighborhoods have had higher noise pollution, including highways or trains in their neighborhoods, built in their neighborhoods. So I'm wondering if you had a chance to look at that, if you had that data available, and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. And yes, you're completely correct. And those are additional factors when we think about creating these kinds of spaces, particularly for disadvantaged communities. And so when I was doing a lot of my literature review, I came across these same factors that do also affect youth mental health in urban settings, particularly when it comes to air pollution. There's a lot of studies that show that having high air pollution negatively affects young people's mental health. We didn't have or pull in the data specifically to look at things like air pollution or like heat, but it's definitely a future further investigation that I think would help strengthen a study like this. When I think about green spaces, and I mentioned this a couple times in my presentation, it's not just about, just creating more green space. It's really thinking about it comprehensively. We can bring in the social ecological model, thinking about the atmosphere, like what you just mentioned, with the pollution and living near highways. We have to think systematically. I think planners, city planners and governments really need to think about if we're really trying to make these communities better and repair the harm that we've done for several decades, how can we strategically, think about design? And I think that's a really important consideration.
Thank you.
You guys can choose who wants to go first.
Okay, this kind of follows up on what Kenzie was kind of just asking you about. But first, thank you for this like really engaging, insightful. I feel like people learned a lot.
I hope so.
Presentation, so great job for that. As researchers, we know that our work builds on the work of our researchers who came before us. And with that in mind, what are things that you hope or think people who are going to come after us would do, like with this body of work?
That's a great question. So first, this is an exploratory study. I think we found some interesting results, but this is just laying the groundwork. There's so many further studies there's so many ways studies can build off of this. Specifically, I think some areas, again, with my limitations, we don't actually measure the use of the space. We use the proxy as that. And so more studies looking at actually like how are young people using the space. A common issue when we think about spatial analyses, which I use, is the modifiable areal unit problem. And that's basically because we use these neighborhoods as our proxies for neighborhoods. There might be a young person who lives in that neighborhood, but the park is like another neighborhood away from them. So taking into consideration like access to other neighborhoods and what that actually looks like. And so doing something like an environmental scan in Baltimore and going to see exactly, where these young people live and like what resources are around them, asking them themselves, like, where do you actually use space and why you don't? I think a qualitative aspect is also important to look at. So we didn't really talk to Baltimore young people themselves, but they're the ones who have the answers and support and know how they use or not use these spaces. So a follow-up study could also just talk to young people and find out, how do you use these spaces? What are your barriers? What are your facilitators? What would you want to do What would you want to invest in if you had endless amounts of money? I think these are the types of conversations that city planners and city officials should be having and with young people in Baltimore. Thank you. Right, we have, what's that, 10:55? How many more questions?
There's a question in the chat.
Okay, can you say it?
Sure. It's by Mo. Since we're talking about city planning and government, how do you think changes in the demographic dividend influence urban planning, the development of green spaces, and or overall approach to your mental health?
Can you repeat the first part? Demographic what?
Demographic dividend influence urban planning. Maybe they can.
Yes, can you elaborate, Mo, on what you mean by demographic dividend?
She's saying how populations are aging and birth rates are declining.
Ah, I see. So basically the idea that there's like urbanization is not happening as fast as before? Is that what she's getting at? I'm trying to get a better understanding.
She's getting at the fact that here we have a growing older population compared to a young population. And how does that influence urban planning as well, while also thinking about youth?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think you're 100% right when you're thinking about growing older populations. I know that there is research being done when it comes to looking at green space in older populations. And speaking with Michael, we were just talking about how some work in, I believe it was Detroit, if I'm correct, but I think it's Detroit, but there are older people who live near blue spaces, but those blue spaces are like contaminated, and so they have higher levels of dementia. And so, again, when you're thinking about like green space, blue space, environmental spaces, we have to think about both the risk as well as the reward, and really think about whether or not these environments, how they are currently or need to be revitalized or improved, are affecting, both young people and older adults, mental health. Definitely an area of that's interesting, and would love to talk to you more about it if you have ideas. Right. Well, thank you all for coming. There's gonna be a reception. If you guys stay around, there's gonna be a reception on the 9th floor, in a couple hours.
Okay. Tina, beautiful presentation. Thank you, everyone. We're gonna exit. And to everyone online, thank you so much for being here, and she'll connect with you later.
Wait, can I get one selfie? All right, guys. I gotta remember.
Should we all wave?
Yeah. Thanks, y'all. Love you all.
Oh,
Huh?